Now, the first thing you're going to notice when you compare these two cameras is the weight of the bodies. And the Canon R7 weighs almost twice as much as the Canon R10. And for me, I think that makes the Canon R10 kind of an exciting sort of lightweight travel camera, something you could put a small lens on, take around with you all day, and you'd hardly notice it was there. Where the Canon R7 feels a bit more like one of Canon's full-frame mirrorless cameras. It's a very, very similar size and weight, and in fact, it's actually bigger and heavier than the RP, and I think it might even be bigger and heavier than the EOS R. So it definitely feels like one of those full-frame bodies from Canon. I think sometimes we have a tendency to think something that's heavier has a better build quality. When I'm handling both of these cameras and I sort of tap on the polycarbonate or plastic housing on both of the cameras, I'm not sensing that one is necessarily better than the other. It is possible that Canon intentionally made the plastic on the R7 thicker than the plastic on the R10. But I think really there might be a perception of the build quality being significantly better on the R7, but I think in reality they're probably pretty similar. When it comes to the grip, you are going to find that the grip on the R7 is significantly deeper. Now, most of the extra depth of that grip is after you get past the finger point. So you don't actually have more sort of grip for your fingers. It's very, very similar in that regard. It's actually the thickness of the body that is deeper when we compare these two cameras. And because of that, on the R7, I almost struggle to get my hand around it. It's almost too big for me, where with the R10 is really just about perfect. So I think as far as the grip goes, they're not so dissimilar that you're going to love one or hate the other. But I do think if you have smaller hands, you're probably going to prefer the R10. If you have bigger hands, you're probably going to prefer the R7. I consider my hands to be sort of a medium size, so I can sort of go either way. But I do slightly prefer the grip on the R7, or the R10, I mean. I think the R7 is just a little bit too deep sort of for my palm. I prefer the R10. Now, a lot of people are going to buy these cameras with the kit lens, and I think the most common setup you are going to see is the R10 equipped with the 18-45 kit lens, and I think you are generally going to see the R7 with the 18-150 kit lens. This actually makes a huge difference in price. You have about a $500 difference in price to begin with if we're just looking at the bodies. But once you add these lenses on, now you have an $800 difference in price. So that is fairly significant. I will also mention that neither of these kit lenses actually come with a lens hood. If you buy either of these, I strongly recommend you order a third-party lens hood. In the description down below, I've got the lens hoods listed for both of these. It's only around $10. It protects that front element of your glass, and it can actually improve image quality because it blocks stray light coming from the side, which can reduce contrast and detail in your images. So if you buy either of these, definitely get the lens hoods. As I said, it's like around $10 or something like that. And once we add the most common kit lenses that either of these are going to use, you can see that the R7 is getting bigger and heavier, and you can see the R10 is much smaller. So with the most likely kit lenses you're going to buy, it gets even a bigger difference in sort of size and weight. And I will have some detailed reviews covering both of these kit lenses coming up. I would suggest, just off the cuff, neither of them are the sharpest or most amazing lenses I've ever used, but I think they're both sufficient as kit lenses. And I think you've got that 18-150, which is like a super versatile lightweight travel lens. And then you've got the little 18-45. And even though it's not the best lens I've ever used or the sharpest, most detailed lens I've ever used, when you buy it in a kit, you only pay an extra $100 for it. And it is well worth $100. So if you're buying either of these cameras and you're thinking about not getting a kit lens, I would definitely go with the 18-45. That lens is definitely worth $100. Now, looking at the ergonomics on both of these cameras, what I found interestingly is the buttons on the R7 are a bit more premium. If you look at the shutter button, it's got a very long throw, sort of consistent feel to it, and there's no sort of click at the end. This is designed so that when you are going to take a photo, you don't actually have any sense of what point it's going to fire the shutter. So you don't have any resistance and then a click. The reason for this is it stops the photographer from anticipating that point and pushing. They've got the click and then they push really hard and they get camera shake. So you're just pushing gradually, and sort of in the middle of that just sort of range of the button being squished down, the camera all of a sudden fires. So it tends to be a bit of surprise to you, and it stops that sort of excitement sort of camera button push where you might move the camera. The R10 actually has a bit of resistance. You feel that sort of half press, and then you push the rest of the way. So it is a very different feel. It is a little bit less premium feel. There might be some sort of beginning photographers that might actually prefer that sort of clickiness of the R10 button. But generally speaking, the way that the R7 button is considered sort of a more premium button in cameras. I also find throughout the buttons on the rest of the camera that the R7 is similar. It's got these sort of long throw, more squishy buttons, where the R10 has sort of more just sort of clicky buttons. They feel a little bit more consumer level. Now, the R10 has 2 custom modes on the top of it, so it's got 2 custom mode dials. You can program those to sort of, whether it be slow motion video or some sort of photo, you can pre-program those to settings that you normally use, save them to the camera, and you can go straight to them and access those modes. The R10 has 3 of those modes. In addition to that, because the R10 has an actual dedicated photo and video switch, so you click this once, now you're on in photo mode. You click it a second time, now you're on in video mode. It actually means that those 3 different custom function sort of settings on the dial are photo and video settings. So you get 3 custom functions for video, and you get 3 custom functions for photo. This also goes for all the other selections on the dial. If you're in photo mode, you get a set of settings that you've set for photo mode on those different settings. You go to video mode, you get a completely different set of settings. So this is extremely powerful. And if you are a hybrid shooter and going back and forth, that certainly is a sort of valuable function. And when we look at the dial layout, they both have the same dial at the top here between the R7 and the R10. The R10 has a more conventional thumb dial here, which I prefer probably because I've worked with that my whole life, where the R7 has this sort of joystick and dial in one thing, which is a little bit unusual, and I am getting used to it. Some people really, really don't like it, but I am getting used to it. And then you've got your joystick in the center here, where the R10 has a more sort of traditional conventional layout. It still has the joystick here, and then it has the thumb dial here. So I think that's just a matter of personal preference. Because you probably have never used a camera that has this unusual sort of dial and joystick in the center thing, it's probably something that you ideally want to play with in store first before you make a decision whether it's any good for you. As I said, when I started out, I wasn't in love with it, but I'm actually getting used to it, and I think it's fine. I still probably prefer the conventional thumb dial at this stage. When it comes to weather sealing, the R10 does not have weather sealing. The R7 does. This is a pretty big thing if you're a landscape photographer, you're shooting in rain, or if you're shooting outside and you have no idea what conditions you're going to encounter. The R7, as long as it's got a sort of weather seal lens on it, is going to be pretty well protected. The R10, there is a risk that your sort of camera will die. So I think that is a pretty big deal. The other thing that this R7 has, the R10 doesn't, is when you take the lens off, you'll see the shutter is automatically left down to protect the sensor. On the R10, the sensor is just exposed, so you can get dust or dirt in there when you're sort of changing lenses or what have you in the field. So that is a pretty big deal if you're sort of working in dirty environments. The R7 has dual card slots, which are accessed via a separate door on the side of the camera. The R10 has a single card slot, which is accessed via the battery door. The R7 is obviously got a better setup for this. It also has the ability to shoot backup photos, so you can record photos to either card. You can set it up so it records RAW files to one card, JPEGs to another. So you've got a lot of flexibility and redundancy as far as your data storage in the R7, which you don't in the R10. For video shooters, the R7 has a headphone jack. This allows you to monitor your audio when you're actually shooting. It also gives you the ability to actually listen to your audio back when you're shooting and you're sort of playing the video, so you can really get a good idea of what's going on. They both have microphone jacks, but only the R7 has a headphone jack. Now, they both have fully articulating touchscreens, but the R7 has a 1.62 million dot touchscreen, where the R10 has a 1 million dot touchscreen. Now, this might not sound like a humongous big deal at first, but actually when I am using both of these in the field and I'm trying to punch in or I'm reviewing photos to see if they're sharp, in the R10, they pretty much always look blurry because there's just not enough resolution on the screen. Where with the R7, I get a pretty good idea of what I'm getting, both when I'm reviewing my photos or videos or when I'm sort of punching in to try to nail focus. So I found this to be a rather significant difference. Now, this will not affect the finished quality of the photos. Once you take the photos, put them on the computer, well, they're going to look like they look. This is just while you're in the field, either reviewing the photos or trying to sort of nail manual focus. So I do think for some people, that extra resolution on the R7 is going to be quite a big deal. And the other thing with both of these touchscreens is the touchscreens on your camera are the most fragile part of the camera. The most likely thing to break on your camera is the touchscreen. And the first thing I did with both of these cameras when I got them is I ordered screen protectors for them. You get 3 screen protectors for less than $10. If you buy either of these cameras or you own either of these cameras, the absolute first thing you should do is order a screen protector for it. And I will link in the description down below the screen protectors I'm using for both of these cameras. And I've gone through a number of different screen protectors over the years, and these are the ones for me that give the best performance. They look the most clear. They cause no problems whatsoever. You can even fold the screens in still with the screen protectors on. And if you don't have a screen protector for either of these cameras, you're crazy, just go out and get a screen protector. Now, looking at the EVF, they both have a 2.36 million dot EVF. The R7 has 1.15 times magnification, and the R10 has, I think it's 0.95 times magnification. This does make a bigger difference than you would think, and the R7 does give you better eye relief, just sort of more room to look through. I shoot with glasses on. I'm definitely shooting better with the R7. The one thing I will say is, in regards to the electronic viewfinder on both of these, as far as the size and the eye relief and the detail, they are a little bit subpar compared to some of the competitors at this price point. These cameras are loaded with features, particularly sort of the video features that other cameras at this price point do have a little bit of trouble competing with. But when it comes to the EVF, it's not quite as good as, say, some of the Fuji cameras as a comparison at similar price points. So I do think that these cameras do let themselves down just a little bit in that area. Now, the menu system and the layout and the way that it works once you're punching through the touchscreen and the menus is virtually identical between the two. I couldn't really pick any differences. So I think they are the same menu system. And of course, this is Canon's menu system, the type of menu system they have in all of their cameras. And from my perspective, I think the Canon menu system is the best on the market. And it has a couple different levels of features. You can either turn on some like really easy assisting mode that assists you and explains things as you go through and do your settings, or you can sort of turn all that off and go into sort of more of a pro level mode, which just gives you the sort of generic normal menus, doesn't explain anything to you. So once you know the camera well, you can sort of go through and just pick out what you need. You don't lose any control when you go in this sort of simple menu system, but it just gives you a better explanation of what is going on. So I think this is fabulous for new users. I think this, as far as the ergonomics and the usability goes, that puts both of these cameras really ahead of anything else at this price point. In my testing of the autofocus, I found that the performance was identical. I really couldn't tell the difference between one and the other. It really does pick up faces and eyes and objects way in the distance, much farther than you would expect. And I find the video autofocus to be pretty well spot on. I did have a couple times where it was drift now and then, but this is the first firmware version for these cameras, so I suspect we will get a firmware update that will sort of tweak that out. The other thing I will say is if you're shooting sort of sports and wildlife and either the person or the bird or whatever is way off in the distance and very small in frame, I do find that now and then it will front or back focus. It's sort of not terrible, but if the item is really small in the frame, it can be as much as 30% of the time this happens. Now, having said that, when I compare this to other brands, these cameras are telling me that it is identifying these objects so much further away than any camera that I've ever used. I think in some ways the camera is just almost being overly optimistic of what it can reach and what it can nail focus on. So I don't think in that way it's actually performing worse than any of these other cameras of any of the other brands. I would suggest the cameras and the other brands aren't even going to be able to identify that person or that object or that bird that far away. So I don't think you're sort of getting a poor performance here. I just think the camera thinks it's identified the thing, but hasn't been able to quite tune that focus in. Once again, my suspicion is that we will get a firmware update, which will bring this more up to 90, 95% at some point, because it's definitely putting the box around them right things. It's just not quite nailing focus some of the time. Once again, not a deal breaker at all, but just something I thought I should mention. Looking at battery life, on the R7, you are going to get 380 shots if you're using the EVF and 660 if you're using the LCD. Now, these are the camera ratings. I find these are always lower than what you're actually going to get. In my experience, I could shoot all day with this camera and I had no problems. I didn't run out of battery. With the R10, you are going to get 210 with the EVF and 340 with the LCD. So you're almost about half, really. One thing I will say is it is pretty cheap to buy second batteries for either of these cameras. And in the description below, I will put some third-party batteries that I bought and are using with both of these cameras. And really, they work pretty well on par as the sort of factory batteries for a fraction of the price. So even though you're getting better battery life out of the R7, the batteries aren't that expensive for the R10, and they're small and they're cheap, and you throw one of those in your pocket and now you've brought it up to sort of the battery performance of the R7. So I think sometimes people make a really big difference, a big deal about battery performance, when in fact it's just a matter of carrying one tiny little extra battery in your pocket. The only time I can see this being an issue is if you're doing sort of long-form video recording and you don't have the ability to swap that battery out. But for me, if I'm shooting with the R10, once I see that battery down to about 3/4, I just swap it out when it's convenient. So I don't find that it really changes my experience having that extra battery life in the R7 over the R10. Looking at video battery life in the R7, I'm getting sort of real world 2 hours and 15 minutes. I haven't fully tested the R10, but I think it's going to be around an hour, maybe as much as an hour and 15 minutes. So I think as far as that video goes, particularly if you're doing sort of long form recording, you're probably going to get somewhere in the ballpark of twice the length of time on the R7. So if you are doing some really long form video recording, that is a huge advantage to the R7. Now, one of the biggest differences between these two cameras is that the R7 has in-body image stabilization and the R10 does not. Now, I think this is a bigger deal for video shooters than photo shooters. It's also a bigger deal if you are using a lens that's not image stabilized compared to a lens that is image stabilized. Now, in video, if we're looking at the R7 and you're trying to sort of capture a sort of shot or a tracking shot or a panning shot, if you really keep yourself stable, or if you're moving and you do sort of the ninja walk like you would when you're using a gimbal, you can get nearly like gimbal-like performance out of this thing. In addition to that, even if it's not quite gimbal-like, you'll get close enough to that that you can use your software stabilization once you're editing and get it pretty close. So I think for a lot of people in a lot of situations, that Ibis can go very close to replacing a gimbal, just in specific situations. So I think it can be very valuable for video shooters. Having said that, the R10 does have a digital image stabilization, which does crop in a little bit, and you do sacrifice a little bit of quality, but I don't think it's all that noticeable. And when used right, that is pretty good as well. So Canon does have some of the best digital image stabilization on the market. Now, if we look at both of these cameras using the kit lens or any lens that has image stabilization in the lens, what you're going to find is the image stabilization in the lens actually does most of the image stabilization. So when you're using the R7 and you've got the Ibis on and you've got an image stabilized lens, the only thing that the image stabilization in the camera is doing is it's dealing with this axis going this way, and it's dealing with this. The lens is doing the rest. So if you have extremely steady hands and you're using the R10 and you have an image stabilized lens, you're going to find that there is not a dramatic difference between these two videos that you create. Now, I will say that when you are using a camera and you're holding it and you're capturing video, the least cinematic thing that you will ever see in video is video going back and forth like this. So it can be kind of a big deal. With the R7, I can just handhold this, and I know my hands will obviously wobble a little bit, and it will take that out completely. So that footage does look really good. With the R7, if I'm able to keep it completely steady and I'm not rocking it back and forth, it will look virtually identical to the R7. But if I get a little bit of rock, my video image is going to be rocking back and forth. That'll require some image stabilization in editing, which kind of can bring it up to the standard. So I don't want to say that it is like not a big deal at all, that one axis can be a big deal in some situations. Now, when it comes to using non-image stabilized lenses, this is a night and day difference. You will put lenses on the R10 which video will be virtually unwatchable, and on the R7 it will be sort of perfectly smooth. So there is a big difference there. If you are shooting super long telephoto lenses, like you're shooting 400 wildlife or something like that, most of the time the lens is doing most of the image stabilization. So the more zoomed in you get, the more telephoto you get, the less relevant the Ibis is. So if I was shooting either of these cameras with sort of the 100 to 400 and shooting wildlife at 400, I'm barely going to be able to see any difference, or I might not be able to see any difference at all. I will also say if you're shooting wildlife and you want to use like a vintage lens or a lens that's not image stabilized, and you hope that sort of the Ibis and the R7 is going to be able to compensate for that, with a long telephoto lens with no image stabilization, the Ibis does very, very little. It's just the way the mechanics of the whole thing works. The Ibis can't move enough to take the shake out of it. So there's almost no difference with a 400 millimeter non-Ibis lens and Ibis. And I've tested this side by side by turning Ibis on and off. And really, the difference is sort of negligible. So with that sort of telephoto, sort of wildlife stuff for photo, really you need to have an image stabilized lens. The Ibis is not going to make up for that. Looking at the Ibis for photo, I think a lot of people think that the Ibis is going to make a bigger difference than it really is. And there's only very specific situations where the Ibis is helpful in photography. And that is when I am holding the camera and I am not moving. I am trying to be steady like a tripod. And the thing that I'm taking a photo of is not moving. And we're in some sort of low light conditions where we can't have a fast enough shutter speed to freeze that. And it's actually that our handheld motion is going to make that photo blurry. That is when the Ibis can play a role. But if I am moving around, like traveling, the Ibis is not going to compensate for that. It's only going to compensate when I'm sort of staying still and the blurriness is caused by my handshake. If the thing that I am taking a photo of is moving, the Ibis can't fix that. That thing moving is going to be blurry if you have a long shutter speed. The Ibis isn't going to be able to take that movement out of it. So this is very, very important because particularly with sort of sports and wildlife, most of the time the objects are moving very quickly, and the only way that you're actually going to freeze the motion in those objects or in that movement is by using a faster shutter speed. The Ibis isn't going to be able to do anything for you. So I think sometimes people think the Ibis in photography is more important than it is. Once again, just reinforce, the Ibis is important if you are static and the thing you are shooting is static. If the thing you're shooting is moving, it's not going to do much for you. If I'm moving or traveling or in a car or trying to sort of snap something while I'm on the run, it's not going to do much for me either. Really, it's when I'm static and the thing that I'm shooting is static. And to freeze motion in any other situation, really what you need is a faster shutter speed. So that means you either increase your ISO or you need more light. So the Ibis is only useful in very specific situations for photography. Now, one key feature that is different between these two cameras is the sensor. And the R7 has a 32.5 megapixel sensor, and the R10 has a 24.2 megapixel sensor. And I think people think that because of this, they're going to get better images out of the R7. Now, the important thing to understand is that you will only get better images out of the R7 with very, very premium high-end lenses, because you need a lens that resolves the amount of detail that the 32.5 megapixels can take advantage of. With either of these kit lenses, when I've done some shooting and testing, you cannot tell the difference between them. Most of the EF lenses I have, I cannot tell the difference. The 50 millimeter f1.8, I cannot tell the difference. The 35 millimeter f1.8, I cannot tell the difference. And one of the challenges with this and me sort of advising you is I can't find any information out there where people are telling you what lenses can actually resolve the level of detail that the R7 provides. And this was a problem going back to the 90D and the M6 Mark II, which also had a 32.5 megapixel sensor. And for me, the only way that I've been able to test the lenses to see which ones might work and which ones wouldn't is just take the same lens, the same photo side by side with the 24 megapixel sensor and the 32.5 megapixel sensor, and then zoom in and compare them and see if I got any more detail out of the R7. And in my testing on the lenses that I've got, I really couldn't find any difference in the detail. I don't doubt that you can get it, but you're really going to need to know what lenses will resolve that level of detail before you sort of go down this path. So if you're sticking with the kit lenses, or you're using sort of most of the adapted EF lenses, or if you're using previous model EFS lenses, I find as far as the detail in the images, it's unlikely that you're going to be able to tell any difference between these two cameras.
Now, looking at the high ISO noise performance, I could not pick the difference between these two. I shot this comparison probably 4 times, and anytime I thought I saw some sort of small difference, it always turned out to be just the light or the way the cameras were positioned or the way the light was hitting my face or reflecting off something. Really, they are almost indiscernible from each other, and if you did do a blind test and you didn't have them side by side, I absolutely guarantee you couldn't pick the difference. And even side by side, I just go back and forth, and they are so similar that I certainly wouldn't pick one camera over the other just based on high ISO noise performance.
Now, looking at photo, what I found is as the ISO went higher, the R7 looked cleaner with sort of less grain and less grit. The R10 had more of that ISO noise, but it also had more detail left. So I wouldn't say that one is necessarily better than the other. They're just different. And I think what we're seeing is the R7 is probably being a bit more aggressive, with its sort of cleaning, the high ISO cleaning of the image files in photography. And what that's doing is it's robbing the image of a little bit of its detail, but in return, you're getting sort of a smoother, cleaner looking image, where the R7 isn't quite as aggressive. So you're not getting quite as clean of an image, but you are getting more detail left behind because the high ISO noise performance cleaning isn't sort of taking the detail away. So in photography, I don't think one's better than the other. They're just different. It probably just comes down to personal preference. And a lot of people, if they're very serious about their photography, are actually going to be shooting either of these cameras with the ISO noise cleaning or processing turned off, and then they're going to be processing that in post. That gives them a heck of a lot more control. So it really depends on what you're doing, but right out of camera, those are the differences I'm seeing between the two cameras.
Now, looking at the 4K footage out of both of these cameras, the R7 is supposed to have an advantage over the R10 because it can shoot what Canon calls 4K fine. Now, when I put these two next to each other and I play them back to back, even when I zoom in to 400 or 800%, I cannot pick the difference between the two. I think they look identical to each other, and I'm not seeing any extra detail in the R7. Importantly, in any of these standard picture profiles in either camera, they're both shooting 8-bit color footage. Now, the R7 is advertised to shoot 422 10-bit, which is sort of a more pro grade of a way of recording files or video footage, but you can only access that 10-bit footage by using C-Log 3 in the R7. This is something that the R10 can't do. But if you are using that sort of R7 C-Log 3 mode, you get this sort of very washed out image that you have to edit to make look sort of good or in a way that you would actually want to sort of present it. So unless you're interested in using log footage and doing all that sort of editing, then there's really going to be no difference in the 4K footage between these two cameras.
The other thing you're going to see a big difference in is the 4K 60 frames per second mode. In the R7, you have a sort of full sensor 4K 60. Now, this isn't as detailed as the R7's 4K fine mode. It's sort of like a different processing method. So I think there's some line skipping. It's not like a full 7K, sort of every pixel down sampled to 60 frames per second 4K. They use some sort of different method, so you don't have quite the level of detail. I still think it looks pretty good. I don't really have a problem with it. Where the R10 has a massive crop factor. I think it's like 64% of the image is cropped in. So you are really, really zoomed in with the 4K 60 in that. So I think that's a fairly significant handicap, most particularly because when you've chosen a lens to shoot with, it's likely that 64% crop is going to make it that so the lens that you would be using for your 4K normal mode is maybe not the same lens you would be using for your sort of 4K cropped in mode. You might even be forced to change a lens to get access to the right focal length. So It's a heck of a lot more useful in the R7 than it is the R10, that sort of 4K 60 mode. So I think when we're looking at the video specs, if you are a serious video shooter, if you want to shoot log footage, if you want to be shooting 4K 60, yeah, the R7 is a sort of much better camera. But if you're just sort of a casual video shooter and you want some like really nice 4K detailed footage of your family or friends or sort of your vlogging or travel, you're still going to get really good footage out of the Canon R10. Now, if you're looking for cameras in this price bracket, then these aren't the only cameras you should be comparing. And I've just thrown a video on screen now, and if you're looking to get the best camera in this price range, I suggest you check out this video as well.